let's unpack this. When we think about atheism, we usually land on a pretty straightforward definition, right?
Right. It's just a lack of belief in a god or gods.
Exactly. It's almost always framed as a kind of denial or rejection of theological claims. But what if we found a thinker who argues that atheism shouldn't be a statement of what you don't believe?
But a tool for what you do.
A highly focused scientific methodology for investigating history and culture.
And that is the crucial pivot point. That's where we're dedicating this deep dive to the intellectual framework of Safa Kaçmaz. He's a really profound Turkish thinker, born in 1955.
And he wears a few hats. He's a poet, a writer on cultural anthropology, and, importantly for us, the defined founder of what he calls modern scientific atheism.
That name itself is it's designed to make you stop and think. Modern scientific atheism. It feels like a contradiction in terms.
It does. And our mission today is to figure out why he chose that path. We want to really grasp Kaçmaz's central thesis, how he shifts non-belief from a passive stance into a rigorous historical science.
A science aimed specifically at investigating the cultural and the anthropological roots of what we call the sacred.
Right. So for this, we're drawing from his conceptual essays, his poetry, and some incredibly detailed studies he's done on cultural origins.
So if you ever wondered what it looks like when someone tries to move past that old, tired debate of just faith versus denial, you're about to find out.
Let's start with the man himself, because his identity is so fundamental to this whole project. He's not just a dry academic.
No, not at all. He has this essential dual identity. On one hand, he's the rigorous thinker, trying to understand the origin of the sacred.
But on the other hand,
he's a poet. He's searching for the realities, the emotional truths that are hidden under words and symbols.
That blending of what he calls thought with intuition and knowledge with emotion, it seems central to everything.
It's what makes his work so unique. He gets that you can't just dissect the sacred with logic alone. You have to acknowledge the profound human experience that created it in the first place.
So he refuses to separate the cold, rational investigation from that more passionate, poetic search for meaning.
Exactly. And that rational investigation, the scope of it is just immense.
This isn't just a critique of modern religion. It's a huge historical and anthropological sweep. His whole study is grounded in a consciousness that spans civilizations.
He's digging deep into the social, the economic, the cultural origins of all the major religions.
And when we say scope, you mean he's going way back.
All the way back to the earliest recorded stories we have. He does these detailed comparative analyses that start with Mesopotamian religious literature.
So things like the Babylonian creation epic,
the Enuma Eliha, Hesiod's Theogonia. These are cornerstones for him. And then he tracks those narrative threads all the way through the major Abrahamic texts.
The Torah, the Gospel, the Quran.
All of them.
So he's treating these foundational texts not as documents of divine revelation, but more like interconnected anthropological records.
That's a perfect way to put it. He's looking for the common sociological ground. How did all these different cultures across these vast stretches of time handle the ideas of creation, divinity, and social order?
Which reveals the real goal of his research.
Yes, he's trying to show this continuous process, how the concept of the sacred gets built first as an idea in the collective human mind.
And then how it hardens, becomes an institution, a kind of societal memory.
He's always asking the same question. What fundamental social need was this story originally created to solve?
And that question brings us right to the absolute core of his framework, his anthropological thesis on where religion actually comes from.
This is where he completely shifts the ground of the debate.
Okay, so first, what does he reject?
He's very clear on this. He says religion does not originate from a metaphysical will.
Meaning it's not some top-down phenomenon that just appeared.
Right. It's not uncaused. He just sets that whole traditional theological explanation to the side.
So if the origin isn't metaphysical, then it has to be grounded in human reality.
It does. And this is where his background in cultural anthropology really shines. Kaçmaz argues that religion is the product of a memory.
A memory of what?
A memory born directly from the most fundamental pragmatic needs of early human communities. The sacred, for him, is a regulatory invention necessary for survival.
You mentioned before that he's trying to move past both dogmatic theology and dry materialism. Can we quickly define those for the listener? It seems important to understand the two poles he's avoiding.
Sure. So, dogmatic theology, in this context, is the belief that the sacred is an external, unchanging truth that was just given to humanity.
Revealed truth.
A revealed truth. And dry materialism, well, that's more the typical 19th or 20th century position. It often just dismisses religion as a psychological delusion or an economic tool.
The opium of the masses.
That kind of thing. It dismisses the phenomenon without ever really asking why it was so necessary, sociologically speaking.
So Kaçmaz wants to acknowledge that religion is this incredibly powerful, persistent, and functionally necessary human thing. But he insists its origins have to be mapped with historical data, not just faith claims.
Precisely. And to do that mapping, he zeroes in on three core anthropological needs that every early human group had to figure out how to manage. These are the pillars of his theory:
And they are.
food, sexuality, and child sharing.
That is incredibly grounded. How do you get from something as basic as food to something as complex as the sacred?
Because they determine whether you live or die. The rules, the systems, the taboos that a community creates around managing those three things.
How to sustain life, how to reproduce, and how to raise the next generation.
Yes, that was literally the difference between survival and extinction for early groups. If you look at those ancient Mesopotamian texts, they aren't just abstract poetry.
What are they?
They're often rule books. They're establishing who gets to harvest what, who is allowed to mate with whom, and whose job it is to care for the young.
So the power structures and the rituals needed to enforce those basic social rules. The need to share, to regulate, to protect the future. That's what slowly gets sacralized over time.
You've got it. The memory of what kept you alive is the memory of the sacred.
It's an institutional memory of survival rules.
That's the intellectual conclusion, yes. Think about it. If you're struggling to enforce rules about sharing the harvest, assigning those rules to a powerful, eternal God gives them so much more weight.
Than just saying, Joe the chief made this rule up last week.
Exactly. It gives them longevity, it gives them power.
And by identifying those specific roots, food, sex, children, he's giving the sacred a real historical context and weight. He's not just dismissing it as a delusion, he's explaining its utility.
Which brings us to the formal name he gives this whole intellectual project: Modern Scientific Atheism, or MSA.
And this definition, this is the real innovation that separates him from most historical atheist thought.
It is.
So let's really focus on this. It seems to require us to drop our old ideas about what atheism even means. Kaçmaz defines MSA based on active knowledge and investigation.
The methodology is everything. MSA is not a passive position. It's an active, rigorous pursuit. It approaches the origin of the sacred through evidence, through investigation. It's a means of study, not an end position.
Okay, but this sounds a bit like the sociology of religion, which has been around for a long time. Where does Kaçmaz draw the line? What's the critical distinction here?
That's a fair question, and it's a crucial one. While MSA definitely uses sociological and anthropological tools, its intellectual line is different because it's defined from within the context of atheism, of non-belief.
So what does that mean in practice?
It means that MSA doesn't waste its energy just denying the existence of God, because, as Kaçmaz would argue, you don't need a whole scientific method just to deny an unproven claim.
So instead of denial, what's the action?
MSA directs all of its intellectual energy toward researching and documenting the process of its emergence.
Ah, I see.
It's not trying to debunk faith in a confrontational way. It's trying to track, historically and anthropologically, how the systems and symbols of faith were actually born and how they evolved. The subject isn't the divinity, it's the human institution of the divine.
That completely reframes atheism. It goes from being a simple rejection to being a sophisticated scientific reading method for historical and cultural texts.
It's an active intellectual posture that demands empirical rigor.
And that scientific rigor is why the comparative historical analysis is so important to him.
Absolutely. It demands accuracy, it demands anthropological context,
Right.
and it demands that you track the continuity of these social problems: food storage, lineage, reproduction, from the earliest cuneiform tablets right up to today.
Okay, so we have the rigorous thinker, the scientist analyzing social structures, but we have to go back to the other half of his identity,
Yeah.
the poet. How does that poetic side actually fit in with all these hard anthropological facts?
The poetry is the necessary bridge. It's the emotional, the psychological bridge. Kaçmaz knows that while the origins of the sacred might be utilitarian food, sex, children, the experience of the sacred is deeply internal.
So his poetry takes those ancient mythological symbols, the raw emotional material.
And merges them with his historical consciousness.
Yes, he's using the symbolic language of myth to talk about the structural utility that his anthropology uncovered. It lets him discuss the deeper existential dimensions of creating faith without having to take a theological stance himself.
And that synthesis, that combination of the poet and the thinker, leads us to his most profound philosophical statement. It's a single sentence that ties his whole intellectual search back to the idea of human identity.
He says, searching for God is man remembering himself.
Exactly. And if you accept his core thesis that religion is a memory of early social organization, then that quote just clicks into place.
The search for a creator isn't an outward search for some external force.
No, it is, in fact, humanity constantly looking backward through all these layers of myth and ritual, trying to remember how we first figured out how to live together, how those life preserving social systems were first built.
The sacred is the externalized history of our earliest laws, just disguised as cosmology.
That's it.
So that implies that every major creation myth, every theological question about where we came from, is fundamentally an act of self-reflection, an act of historical recall.
We're looking for the origin of the world, but the answer we keep finding is the origin of our society.
And that is his huge intellectual contribution. His work is this comprehensive investigation into how humanity is always creating and recreating its own sacred narrative.
He uses data from Mesopotamia onward to understand this foundational process. He doesn't just study religion. He synthesizes the entire historical trajectory of belief creation itself as a form of social memory.
It's a phenomenal way to challenge both believers and non-believers to look at these texts in a radically new way.
It is. They're not just theological blueprints, they are incredibly valuable archives of early human social memory.
It shifts the entire conversation.
It really does.
So as we wrap up, let's solidify the two key takeaways for you, the listener. First, there's Safa Kaçmaz's anthropological thesis.
That the sacred arises not from some metaphysical will, but from the essential pragmatic social needs of early human life. Specifically, the organization of food, sexuality, and child rearing.
And second,
Modern scientific atheism is not a passive denial of the divine, it's a rigorous scientific methodology. It's dedicated to investigating and documenting the historical and cultural process of how the sacred emerges and evolves in human society.
his whole project really asks us to reevaluate the source of our deepest beliefs. And that brings us back to his quote about historical memory. Kaçmaz identified those three pillars, food, sex, and children, as the source of the sacred. In the ancient world, those needs were handled by immediate local tribal laws.
Right. But today, those three needs are unbelievably complex. Food is managed by global supply chains. Reproduction and sexuality are structured by things like IVF and evolving family structures.
So if those foundational texts hold the memory of our societal origins, the provocative thought is this. Kaçmaz's framework implies that the sacred is always trying to update itself to regulate the current structure of those core social needs.
So, are our modern anxieties about climate change and food scarcity, about shifting family norms, are they already generating new myths, new secular or spiritual stories?
Or, to flip it around, is contemporary society struggling because we're still trying to solve 21st century social problems using a sacred memory that was built to solve 4,000-year-old tribal problems?
That's the question his work forces you to ask. It turns historical analysis into a critical tool for understanding your own moment in time.